All right, so to get started with implementing the sharing functionality in our note sharing application, which admittedly has taken us a little bit of time to get to, let's first talk about how exactly we're going to allow users to share their notes with other users. Okay, now the basic concept of it is this. Currently in our notes database and in our users database, we have the concept of who owns what note. And the way we do that is in our users database, for example, we might have a few different users, and each of these users, of course, has a notes array, which is just an array of the IDs of the notes that that user owns. Okay, so those will sort of point to notes in the note database, so that if we have a bunch of notes over here like this, we can use those IDs in the user's notes array to actually find the notes that belong to the user and make sure that certain users can only access the notes that they own. Okay, so what we're going to do to implement this concept of sharing notes with other users is, well, it's going to be something very similar, actually. What we're going to do is, in addition to each of these notes here having a created by property, right, which is the user that actually owns the note, or the ID of the user that owns the note, that is, we're going to also give each of our notes a shared with property, which will be an array of IDs of all of the users that this note has been shared with, right? So if it's been shared with 123, we'll have 123. If it's been shared with 234, we'll have 234, etc. All right, and you might be wondering if we're going to add a shared notes or something like that, right? Notes shared with user property on each of the users. That's an array of all the notes that have been shared with that user. But in reality, we don't really need to do that, and here's why. Let's assume that the user does have a shared notes property that contains all of the IDs that have been shared with the user. Well, in our server routes, what that would look like is we would have to load the user from the database, and then we would have to say user.shared notes, right? And we'd have to actually load all of the shared notes from the database by saying map and mapping each shared note ID to, an actual database query, right? By saying notesdb.find one, etc. Now, we already did this when we wanted to get all of the notes that belonged to a user, right? That the user had created. But let me show you an easier way. What we're going to do instead, and this really would have worked just fine for displaying all of the notes that a user created as well, so maybe we'll end up changing that a little later on. But what we can do instead is we can just say notes db dot find, and we're going to find all of the notes essentially whose shared by property, or shared with property rather, contains the ID of the user that we're getting all of the shared notes for. Okay, so that would just be, if we wanted to get all of the notes that were shared with user 123, we would just say shared with 123. And MongoDB will automatically, when this property here is an array, MongoDB will make sure to check and see if that property contains this value instead of if the property is equal to that value. That's just something that MongoDB automatically does for us, so you'll see what I mean shortly. But anyway, this to me just seems a little bit easier than having to go through actually loading the user, loading the shared notes, etc. And all we have to do once we've done this is just assign it to a variable and stick it into the user data that we're sending back to the client, right? So we would just say something like ... whatever user data we just loaded from the user database up here, and then we could just say shared notes, and that would be this thing right here, right? So that's going to be our basic plan of attack for implementing sharing functionality in our application from a database standpoint, right? And again, this is something we could even do with just getting all of the notes that a user created. We could just say, notesdb.find created by, and find all of the notes whose created by property is equal to the user, right? So maybe that's something we'll take a look at later on. All right, so we know how that's going to be implemented in the database now, so let's talk a little bit about how all of this is going to work on the front end, okay? So essentially what we're going to do is in the note detail page, which contains the title of the note, contains the text of the note, and currently it just contains an edit button here that when we click on it, changes these things into text inputs and lets the user actually edit the values of those. What we're going to do is add another button, and these will probably be reversed, right? This one will probably be edit here, and this one will probably be share. And what this share button that we're going to add will do is actually take the user to a different page where they can edit the sharing settings for this note. Okay, now that page is going to look a little bit like this. And of course, we're going to be building this shortly, so don't worry too much about it if you don't understand it right off the bat. But what we're going to do is this page is just going to say something like share, and then it will have the title of the note, right? So share my note, for example. And underneath this, it's going to have a list of all of the users that this is currently shared with, right? So probably just their email addresses, etc., right? So blah, blah, blah at blah, 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 blah at blah, 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 and so on. And it's also going to have a form that we can enter users' emails into to share it with specific users. So we'll be able to enter in something like that, and it will add that user to the users that can actually view this note. All right, and that's actually another important thing as well, is that we're not going to allow the users to edit these notes, at least not yet. That's something that we'll probably learn about later on when we talk about how to implement different levels of permissions in a sharing app. Okay, for now, we're just going to allow other users to view our notes. So obviously, we're going to have to also make some changes to the note detail page to make sure that if a user isn't the creator of a note, they don't see this edit button or the share button. They'll just be able to see the contents of that note. All right, now in addition, each of these items here, each of these user emails that a note is currently shared with will, of course, have that little X button component we created that will allow a user to unshare that note with them. All right, so that's what the front end is going to look like, and what we're going to do is actually implement the front end first, and then we'll talk about all of the different server endpoints that will be needed for this flow. Maybe just as an exercise, you could write out all of the different server endpoints that you think that this will need and start planning that out in your head. That would definitely be a good exercise, but that's something we're going to take a look at a little later on. So let's jump right into it. So let's go into our front end now, and the first thing we're going to do is create a new page that will allow us to edit the sharing settings for a given note, and we're going to call this something like note sharing settings page.js. Okay, and here's what this page is going to look like. We're just going to, for now, say export const note sharing settings page equals, and then the JSX is going to look something like this. We're going to say return, and oops, I spelled sharing wrong. Let's fix that there. And what we're going to do, we're going to display an H1 heading up here at the top of our page, which will say share. And just for now, I'm going to put in quotation marks my note. This is where we're going to have to actually get the title of the note that the user is editing the sharing settings for. All right, we'll see how to get that shortly. And the next thing we're going to do here is we're going to display that component that I talked about earlier, which is going to be a list of all of the emails that the note is currently shared with. So, you know what, for now I'm just going to put a div that says this is the note or the shared emails list. And we're going to have another one, maybe these will even be the same component, that will be that form component that the user can type new emails into and, you know, actually add those to this list. So for that we'll say this is the email sharing form. Okay, we'll come back and implement those once we're a little further along with our sharing settings page. And actually, that's about it. All we have to do now is wrap this thing in a React fragment, and that should be all we need to do. So let's create a route for this page now. And to do that, we're going to go to routes.js. We're going to import that page by saying import note sharing settings page. And we're going to define a route here. We'll just put it underneath our note detail page, I suppose. And for this, we'll say protected route, because we do want only authenticated users to be able to access this. And we're going to say is loading equals is loading. And can access is going to be equals is logged in. All right, and then we're going to say redirect to equals. And for that, we're going to say /login, right? So send them back to the login page if the user isn't logged in. And the actual path for this route is going to be /sharing/note ID. You know what? Let's do sharing settings. Why not? Okay, great. So that's our new route. Let's just put our new page inside of it. So we're going to say First of all, slash protected route. Inside here now, we're going to say note sharing settings page. And that should display that page at this route. So let's actually go into our note detail page now and add that button that will link the user to the note sharing settings page. So here's what that's going to look like. We're going to scroll down here to our edit button, which is only displayed if the user is not editing. And we're going to add another button next to that. And this button here is going to say share. And then inside of here, we're going to say onClick equals. And what this will do is actually send the user to the sharing page. So I'm just going to say history.push. Do we have history inside of here already? Let me just take a look here. History.push. It looks like we're going to have to add history to our component. So let's just import that from React Router DOM. We're going to import the use history hook. And down here, we're going to say const history equals use history. And then we can say history.push inside that button. And of course, we're going to send the user to the sharing settings page with the same ID, right? The same URL parameter as the one that we're using for our note detail page here. So that's going to look like this. We're going to say slash sharing settings slash and then the note ID, which we can get by saying note.id. Or I suppose if you wanted to, you could just use this note ID URL parameter. Either one works, it doesn't make that big of a difference. And that should allow us to go to this note sharing settings page. So let's open this up. Let's log in as someone. I don't know, we'll just do john@gmail.com, ABC123, log in. And John currently has no notes, so let's add one. What we're going to do, we'll say this is a test note. We're going to create it. Oops, and it looks like something is wrong. So let me just take a look at, oh, duh, the app isn't running. Let me run that and say npm run dev. I was a little confused at first, I'll be honest. And there we go, we have all of the notes that I remember creating before. So let's try sharing one of these now. We're going to click on share. And sure enough, that will bring up the sharing settings page with the ID of the note that we're trying to share with other users. Cool, so before we move on, I want to adjust the styling for these buttons. What we're going to do is use the evenly spaced class that we created in our index.css a little while ago. Basically, all that does is make sure that all of the child components inside of that div take up an even amount of space. So this will give us the same kind of effect as, here, let me show you. If we click on the delete button, for example, of a note, we see that these buttons are evenly spaced. That's what that CSS class does. So let's do the same thing for our share and edit buttons, just to make it a little bit more, I don't know, make it look a little bit better, I guess. What we're going to do is just wrap this in a div with the class name of evenly spaced. Put those buttons in there, and that should be all we need to do. So if we take a look, yep, sure enough, our buttons are now displayed exactly like we want them to, and I think that looks pretty darn good. Awesome, so now that we have our note detail page taking us to the sharing settings page here, the first thing we need to do is get a hold of the URL parameter, which will allow us to display the actual title of the note that we want to display. Now, this is actually fairly simple. All we're going to do is, just like we did in the note detail page, we're going to find the note with that ID, just like here, and in fact, you can really just copy this if you want to. We're going to copy that. We're going to go to note sharing settings page, and I'm going to paste that code that I just copied with the use context, with the note ID, with everything. That should all work just the same inside of here, provided, of course, we import everything we need to. So let's import the use context hook. Let's also import the notes context by saying import notes context from notes context. And we're also going to need use params, so we'll say import use params from React Router DOM. And that should give us our note all right, but we're also going to need to do the same kind of logic with is loading and update note that we did in our note detail page, right? Well, not update note, I suppose. We can get rid of that one, but we are going to need to know if the note is loading so that we don't prematurely display the 404 page or the note not found page. Okay, so here's what that's going to look like. I'm just going to go into the note detail page to get an idea of what is going to go on here. Basically, we're just going to copy these two things here and put them in our note sharing settings page. And basically, these two things here are going to tell us whether or not the notes are currently loading, right? And In that case, it would just display a loading message. And whether or not the note exists after we're done loading. If it doesn't, just like in our note detail page, we're going to want to display a message saying, we couldn't find this note. Sorry about that. All right, so now that we have our note, the next thing we're going to do is just display the title in here. We're going to say note.title. And that should be all we need to do for our note sharing settings page. Oops, note not found page isn't defined. Let's import that as well. We're just going to say import note not found page, and that should import that and get rid of that error. And just as we wanted, it's now displaying the title of the note that we're editing the sharing settings for. So if we go into another one now and click share, we're going to see the title of that one. And if you want to test a few more of them, you'll see that it's there as well. Awesome, so that's the basic routing setup and logic for our sharing settings page. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.